On the morning of the 1st of July, 1944, 730 delegates from 44 nations arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The hotel had been closed since 1930. Staff had been rushed in at the last moment to open rooms, make beds, and serve meals. The building smelled of disuse. Outside, the Allied armies were fighting across Normandy. D-Day had been 25 days earlier. Many of the delegates at Bretton Woods had sons in that campaign. They received no news during the 3 weeks of the conference. The Boy Scouts who ran messages between committee rooms were under strict instructions not to bring it. They had been brought here to design a financial order for a world that did not yet exist, a world after a war not yet won. Their task was to prevent the monetary chaos of the 1930s from ever happening again. The competitive devaluations, the trade wars, the currency collapses that had deepened the Great Depression and helped produce the conditions for the conflict outside their windows. The United States held nearly 70% of the world's monetary gold. That single fact determined everything that happened at Bretton Woods. When you control the gold, you write the rules. What those 730 delegates agreed to in that reopened hotel, in 22 days of committee rooms and corridor negotiations, would govern global finance for the next 27 years, and its consequences, intended and otherwise, are still governing it today. The design of the post-war monetary system had been underway since 1941, and it had been shaped by two men whose visions were fundamentally incompatible. John Maynard Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods as the most celebrated economist alive. He had been an advisor to the British Treasury since the First World War, had attended the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and had written the book that predicted, with uncomfortable accuracy, that the punitive reparations imposed on Germany would produce another war. He was 60 years old in 1944, in deteriorating health, and he knew it. He also knew that Britain was arriving at Bretton Woods as a debtor nation. The war had cost the empire everything it had in reserve. Keynes understood precisely how weak his negotiating position was, and he argued brilliantly anyway. His proposal was radical. A new international currency he called the bancor, issued by a new global central bank, which would provide liquidity to nations running trade deficits without requiring them to surrender control of their domestic economies. It was an elegant system that would have distributed monetary power across nations rather than concentrating it in any single one. The Americans rejected it entirely. Harry Dexter White was the chief American negotiator. He was 51 years old, the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants, educated at Harvard, and he had spent the previous 3 years in the US Treasury building the American position with meticulous care. He was not, by any account, as intellectually dazzling as Keynes. He was, however, holding 70% of the world's gold, and he knew exactly what to do with that fact. Before we go further, if this kind of history matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the financial decisions that actually changed the world. The crises, the policy failures, the moments when the system revealed what it was designed to protect. If that is the kind of analysis you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you live through one of these turning points? The 2008 collapse, the 70s oil shock, the end of Bretton Woods? Did it change your family's circumstances, your understanding of how money actually works? Leave it in the comments. The most complete record of these events is not in any official report. It is in the people who were paying attention. Now, back to the account. The agreement that emerged from Bretton Woods was fundamentally the White Plan with strategic concessions to Keynes. The bancor was abandoned. There would be no new international currency. Instead, the dollar would serve as the world's reserve currency, and it would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other nation would peg its currency to the dollar, not to gold directly, but to the dollar, which was convertible to gold. This created a hierarchy with a single country at its apex. Any nation wishing to settle an international debt, purchase oil, or maintain a foreign exchange reserve would need to hold dollars. The United States, in turn, was obligated to maintain the $35 peg, to exchange any dollar presented by a foreign central bank for the equivalent in gold. To manage this system, two new institutions were created. The International Monetary Fund would monitor exchange rates and lend reserve currencies to nations facing balance of payments crises. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, would finance post-war reconstruction and economic development. The Soviet Union had sent a delegation to Bretton Woods. It signed the final act. It then declined to ratify the agreements. Moscow calculated, correctly, that participation in a dollar-denominated monetary system would mean subordination to American financial authority. The Cold War's financial architecture was being laid at the same tables as its ideological opponents' rejection of it. 22 days after the conference opened, the delegates signed the Bretton Woods Agreement on the 22nd of July 1944. The war was still being fought, Europe was still burning, and the financial order of the post-war world had just been decided in a mountain hotel in New Hampshire. The man who had imposed the dollar on the world had a secret. Harry Dexter White had spent the 3 years before Bretton Woods not only building the American negotiating position, but passing information to Soviet intelligence. He had been identified by American counterintelligence as a source of classified Treasury documents. His code name in Soviet cables was Jurist. He was, by the assessment of subsequent historians, the highest-ranking Soviet asset in the Roosevelt administration. He did not appear to be acting for money. The evidence that has emerged from declassified Soviet cables and post-war intelligence archives suggests he acted from ideology, a conviction that American-Soviet cooperation was not merely desirable but historically necessary. He believed, in the language of his time, in the Soviet experiment. This creates one of the more extraordinary ironies of 20th-century financial history. The man who built the architecture of American dollar dominance, who outmaneuvered Keynes, defeated the bancor, and placed the United States at the apex of the global monetary hierarchy, was simultaneously feeding information to the country that refused to participate in the system he was building. White was appointed as the first American executive director of the International Monetary Fund in 1946. In 1947, under FBI pressure, he resigned. In August 1948, he appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee and denied under oath that he had spied for the Soviet Union. His testimony was composed, even defiant. 3 days later, on the 16th of August 1948, Harry Dexter White died of a heart attack at his farm in New Hampshire. He was 55 years old. The institution he had created, the IMF, had not yet become fully operational. The system he had designed would not reach its final form until 1958. John Maynard Keynes signed the Bretton Woods Agreement on the 22nd of July 1944. He signed it knowing its design was flawed. He had said so, clearly, in his closing speech at the conference. "We, the delegates of this conference, have been trying to accomplish something very difficult to accomplish." What he understood, and what he communicated in the documents he produced after Bretton Woods, was the structural problem at the heart of what White had built. If the dollar was to serve as the world's reserve currency, every other nation would need to accumulate dollars. The only way for them to accumulate dollars was for the United States to run a balance of payments deficit, to send more money out into the world than it brought in. But if the United States ran persistent deficits, foreign-held dollars would eventually exceed America's gold reserves, and when that happened, the $35 peg would become a fiction. But was not Keynes who formulated this as a precise economic theorem? That work was done by the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin, who published it in 1960. But the logic was visible in 1944 to anyone looking for it. Keynes returned to Britain from Bretton Woods exhausted. He had one more major negotiation ahead of him, the terms of the American loan to Britain, which he conducted in Washington in late 1945. The Americans drove a hard bargain. Britain received what it needed, but on conditions that effectively ended the sterling area and dismantled the last formal structure of British financial independence. On the 21st of April 1946, John Maynard Keynes died of a heart attack at his home in East Sussex. He was 62 years old. The Bretton Woods system, which he had helped design against his own preferences and better judgment, would outlive him by 25 years. The Bretton Woods system did not become fully operational until 1958, when the major European currencies finally became convertible. For more than a decade after the conference, the world operated under emergency currency controls whilst Europe rebuilt and the dollar shortage persisted. When the system did function, it functioned well. The quarter century between 1948 and 1973, broadly the Bretton Woods era, produced the most stable period of economic growth in modern history. Western Europe rebuilt. Japan industrialized. Global trade expanded. The IMF provided the financial safety net. The World Bank provided reconstruction capital. The dollar served as the lubricant of international commerce. But Robert Triffin's warning came true. To supply the world with the dollars it needed, the United States ran persistent balance of payments deficits throughout the 1960s. American military spending in Vietnam and Korean expeditions, combined with President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society domestic programs, expanded the dollar supply far faster than American gold reserves could support. By 1964, foreign-held dollars exceeded the American gold stock. The $35 peg had become, as Keynes had understood it would, a promise the United States could not keep. Foreign governments began to notice. France, under Charles de Gaulle, converted dollars into gold at the $35 rate, with particular enthusiasm, a deliberate challenge to what de Gaulle described as America's exorbitant privilege. Between 1958 and 1971, American gold reserves fell from $22 billion to $10 billion. The drain was accelerating. On Sunday evening, the 15th of August 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on American television and announced that the United States would no longer honor the dollar's convertibility to gold. 27 years after Bretton Woods, the system the conference had built was over in a single television address. The Bretton Woods system ended on the 15th of August 1971. But its consequences did not. The dollar did not lose its reserve currency status when Nixon severed the gold link. It retained that status and retains it today, not because of the $35 peg, but because of the institutional infrastructure built at Bretton Woods. The IMF, the World Bank, the dollar-denominated architecture of global commodity markets, international debt contracts, and central bank reserves. What ended in 1971 was the constraint. The United States no longer needed to hold gold to back every dollar it issued. The dollar became, in the language of economics, a pure fiat currency, backed not by metal, but by American institutional credibility. This gave the United States what de Gaulle had identified as an exorbitant privilege, the ability to run deficits that no other nation could sustain, to print money to fund obligations that would have bankrupted any other government, and to sanction adversaries by cutting them off from the dollar system that the rest of the world still required. The system Keynes feared, monetary power concentrated in a single nation without the corrective mechanisms he had proposed, was precisely what emerged from 1971 onwards. The IMF and World Bank that White created are still operational. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves, which peaked above 70% in the 1970s, has declined to approximately 58% as of 2024. BRICS nations are developing alternative settlement systems. Central banks are buying gold at rates not seen since the 1960s. The architecture of challenge to dollar dominance is the same architecture Keynes described in 1944. Distributed monetary power across multiple centers rather than a single one. In that conference hotel in the White Mountains, 73 days after D-Day, two men fought over who would write the rules of money for the post-war world. One of them was a Soviet spy. The other was dying. Between them, they produced a system that governed the global economy for 27 years, and whose ghost still haunts every debate about the international monetary order today. If this account has given you a clearer understanding of how financial power actually operates, subscribe to the channel. There are more crises, more decisions, more turning points still to document. And if this period of history connects to something you lived through or something a family member witnessed, the bank runs, the inflation, the austerity, the moment a system everyone trusted stopped working, tell us in the comments. What did they see? What did it cost them? What did they believe afterwards? The official version of these events is always written by the institutions that survived them. The fuller version belongs to the people who did not.